Take your check and go back to your little bookstore.
You were never worthy of this family. I loved this family. Please, just tell them this isn't how our story ends.
I'm sorry.
No, you're only sorry because they're watching.
The rain had just stopped when Eleanor Brooks stepped out of the town car outside the Carter Foundation's annual gala. And for a moment she stood beneath the hotel's glass awning, watching the water bead and slide off the fabric of her sleeve like it was trying to decide whether to stay. She smoothed the front of her dress, navy, modest, borrowed courage stitched into every seam, and reminded herself of the only thing she'd told herself all week. You belong here. You are his wife. Inside, the ballroom of the Whitmore Grand glittered like something built specifically to remind ordinary people they weren't invited. Chandeliers the size of small cars threw gold light across 300 faces Eleanor didn't know and one face she used to. Waiters moved between the tables with trays of champagne balanced like offerings. A string quartet played something that sounded expensive. Somewhere near the stage, a projection screen displayed the words Carter Foundation, building tomorrow in letters 12 feet tall, and beneath them, smaller, almost an afterthought, Eastbridge Historic Redevelopment, unveiling tonight. Eleanor found her husband near the front, exactly where she expected him to be, orbited by investors, flanked by his mother, lit from every angle by a room that had learned to love him before it had ever learned to love her. Damien Carter looked, as he always did in rooms like this, like a man built for applause. Tailored charcoal suit, jaw set in the particular way that made people trust him with their money. When his eyes found Eleanor across the room, something flickered there. Not quite warmth, not quite guilt. Something closer to inconvenience. You came, he said, when she reached him. Not your hair, not you look beautiful. Just an observation, delivered like a man noting the weather had changed. You invited me, Eleanor said quietly. My mother invited you. Before Eleanor could answer, Victoria Carter appeared at her son's shoulder the way she always did. Silent until she wasn't, sharp-edged beneath silk the color of dried blood. Victoria's smile was a masterwork of civility, the kind that had closed 1,000 deals and ended a dozen marriages that weren't hers. Eleanor. Victoria's eyes swept her once, top to bottom, cataloging and dismissing in the same breath. How brave of you to wear that, hey? Eleanor had learned, over 6 years of marriage, that there was no version of a response that would satisfy Victoria Carter. So she said nothing. She had gotten very good at saying nothing. Across the ballroom, a young woman in emerald silk laughed at something on Damien's other side, a laugh pitched exactly loud enough to carry. Olivia Reyes, the newest vice president of Carter Development, had a gift for being seen without ever appearing to try. She caught Eleanor's eye for half a second, and in that half second, something passed between them that Eleanor didn't yet have a name for. She would have a name for it soon. The evening moved the way these evenings always moved. Champagne, small talk, a slideshow of glass towers that didn't exist yet. Damien's voice warm and practiced at the podium describing $100 million vision for a neighborhood Eleanor had walked through 1,000 times as a girl. She listened to him describe Eastbridge, her grandfather's neighborhood, her childhood, as though it were an empty canvas waiting for his signature. She didn't say anything. She had learned the shape of his silence so well by now that it fit her like a second skin. She didn't know yet that the canvas wasn't empty. She didn't know that somewhere in a vault 3 miles from where she stood, her grandfather had spent 40 years making sure it never would be. She was still holding her champagne, untouched, when Victoria Carter climbed the 3 steps to the stage instead of her son. The room's applause faltered into confusion. Damien, halfway back to his seat, turned with a smile still frozen on his face. The smile of a man who hadn't been told about a change in the program. Before we continue with the unveiling, Victoria said into the microphone, her voice hunted and enormous in the silent ballroom. I think it's time this family was honest about something. Eleanor felt the first cold thread of dread slide down the back of her neck. For 6 years, Victoria continued, my son has carried a burden with more grace than most men could manage. A marriage that began with good intentions and outgrew its purpose. Tonight, in front of the people who matter most to this family's future, I think it's time we set him free to build that future properly. 300 faces turned toward Eleanor at once. She felt herself become very small and very visible in the same instant, the particular vertigo of being looked at by everyone and seen by no one. Eleanor. Victoria said her name like a verdict. Would you come up, Day? Eleanor didn't move. Beside her, Damien's hand found the small of her back. Not comfort, she understood immediately, but pressure, guiding her forward the way you'd guide something you needed off the stage before the real show began. She walked up those 3 steps because the alternative was 300 people watching her refuse, and some animal part of her still couldn't bear to be watched failing at anything, even this. Victoria met her at the podium with an envelope in one manicured hand and a folded document in the other. Her voice dropped. Private for a moment, meant only for Eleanor, though the microphone caught every word and threw it to the rafters. Take this, Victoria said, pressing the envelope into Eleanor's hands, and return to your little bookstore. You were never meant for this family. The ballroom silence had a texture to it, thick, expectant, cruel in its patience. Eleanor looked down at the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She could feel the shape of a check inside, could guess the number would be large enough to be an insult disguised as generosity. 6 figures, probably. Enough to prove she'd been bought out cheaply, from a family that measured worth only in what it could write on a check. She looked up, past Victoria, to Damien. He was watching from the front row now, his hands in his pockets, his expression arranged into something that might have passed, from a distance, for regret. He said nothing. 6 years of marriage, and in the moment that mattered most, her husband found nothing worth saying. The applause started somewhere near the back, polite, uncertain, the particular applause of people who understood they were watching a woman's life end in real time and had decided the correct response was to clap anyway. Eleanor set the unopened envelope down on the podium. She didn't cry. She had promised herself years ago, somewhere around the 3rd time Victoria Carter had made her feel like a stain on the family carpet, that she would not give this family the satisfaction of her tears in a room full of cameras. Instead, she smoothed her dress the way she had in the lobby, an hour and a lifetime ago, and she walked back down the 3 steps, through the parting crowd, past the tables of people who would not meet her eyes, out through the gold doors of the Whitmore Grand and into the wet Chicago night. Security did not need to escort her. She had never needed to be told twice when she wasn't wanted somewhere. Behind her, muffled by the closing doors, she heard Victoria's voice resume, bright and unbothered, introducing the next phase of the evening as though nothing had happened at all. As though a marriage hadn't just been ended in front of 300 strangers with less ceremony than a corporate merger. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk in the rain that had started again, and for the first time that night, she let herself feel exactly how alone she was. She didn't know yet that she wasn't. If this story has already pulled you in this early, if you felt that ballroom go quiet right along with Eleanor, go ahead and hit subscribe now, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Stories like this hit different when we're all watching together. Now, let's go back 6 years, to the beginning, before any of this happened. Because to understand what Eleanor lost tonight, you have to understand what she built first. 6 years earlier, Eleanor Brooks was 26 years old and covered in dust. She was on her knees in the back room of Brooks & Sons Booksellers, the store her grandfather Walter had opened in 1968 and never once let go of, sorting through a donation box of water-damaged paperbacks when the bell above the front door chimed. She didn't look up right away. The bell chimed a dozen times a day, mostly regulars, mostly people who wanted somewhere quiet to sit for an hour with a book and a cup of the terrible coffee Eleanor brewed in a machine older than she was. "Excuse me," a man's voice said. "I think I'm lost." Eleanor looked up. The man standing in the doorway of her grandfather's bookstore looked like he'd wandered in from a different century entirely. Expensive coat, expensive watch, the kind of haircut that cost more than her monthly rent. He looked, more than anything, like a man who had never once in his life been lost. "You're either lost," Eleanor said, standing and brushing dust from her jeans, "or you're the first person in a decade to wander in here by accident wearing a coat like that." He smiled, and something about the smile surprised her. It wasn't the practiced, camera-ready smile she'd later come to recognize as his professional face. It was smaller, more uncertain, almost boyish. "My car broke down 2 blocks from here," Damien Carter said. "I was told there was a coffee shop nearby. I may have been misled." "There's a coffee shop 3 blocks that way," Eleanor said, pointing. "This is a bookstore that happens to serve coffee that will probably shorten your life. I'll take my chances." He stayed for 2 hours that afternoon, waiting for a tow truck that took considerably longer than it should have, mostly because Eleanor suspected, correctly, as it turned out, that he'd stopped rushing it along somewhere around the 90-minute mark. He asked her about the store, about her grandfather, about the framed black-and-white photograph behind the register of a young man standing in front of the same storefront in 1968, proud and unsmiling in the way men of that generation often were in photographs. He started it with almost nothing, Eleanor told him, refilling his coffee for the 3rd time. "Just this space and about 200 books." He used to say a neighborhood without a bookstore was a neighborhood that had forgotten how to dream. "That's a nice sentiment," Damien said. "Doesn't pay the electric bill, though." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It doesn't." She didn't tell him, that first day, about the eviction notice from 3 months prior that her grandfather had somehow made disappear with a single phone call to a lawyer she'd never met. She didn't know yet that there was anything to tell. To her, in that moment, Brooks & Sons was just a struggling bookstore that refused to die, kept alive by a stubborn 80-year-old man and his granddaughter's unpaid labor. She didn't know that her grandfather had spent 40 years quietly, patiently, invisibly assembling something far larger than a bookstore. That Eastbridge, the historic 6-block neighborhood around them, was slowly and deliberately becoming his, parcel by parcel, deed by deed, protected by trust with names so boring no one had ever thought to ask what they actually held. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that a stranger in an expensive coat had made her laugh twice in one afternoon, and that when the tow truck finally arrived, some small, foolish part of her was disappointed. "I'd like to come back," Damien said, standing in the doorway with a late afternoon light behind him. "It's a bookstore," Eleanor said. "The door's usually unlocked. I meant to see you." That was how it started, quietly, ordinarily, the way most things that later feel inevitable actually begin. He came back the next week, and the week after that, and by the 3rd month he wasn't pretending to be interested in books anymore, and by the 6th month Eleanor had stopped pretending she minded. Those early years were good. Eleanor believed that, still, even now, even after everything, she believed the early years had been real. Damien used to sit on the store's ancient reading chair after closing, feet up on a crate of unsorted inventory, and talk about the buildings he wanted to build, the neighborhoods he wanted to transform, the legacy he wanted to leave that would be bigger than his father's name. Eleanor used to think that ambition was one of the most attractive things about him, a man who wanted to build something that would outlast him. She didn't understand yet that there's a particular kind of ambition that starts as a dream and slowly, patiently, curdles into hunger. She didn't understand that Damien's father had died when Damien was 19, leaving him a company and a mother who measured love in market share, and that somewhere in the years before Eleanor ever met him, Damien had learned that the only currency Victoria Carter respected was winning. They married 18 months after the broken-down car. It was a small wedding, Eleanor's choice, though Damien had agreed easily enough at the time, held in the courtyard behind the bookstore, string lights instead of chandeliers, Walter Brooks giving away his granddaughter with tears he pretended were allergies. Victoria attended, dressed like she was at a business dinner rather than her son's wedding, and gave a toast that managed to congratulate Damien on his interesting choice without once looking directly at Eleanor. Eleanor didn't understand that toast for what it was until much later. At the time, she thought it was simply awkwardness. She had not yet learned to recognize Victoria Carter's particular language, the smile that meant contempt, the compliment that meant warning. The first 2 years of marriage were, by any honest accounting, happy ones. Damien worked long hours, but he came home to the small apartment above the bookstore that Eleanor had refused to leave, and he'd sit at the kitchen table while she cooked and talk about his day like it mattered whether she understood the details. He'd ask about her grandfather, whose health was beginning its slow decline by then, with what Eleanor believed at the time was genuine tenderness. The shift happened so gradually that Eleanor could never afterward pinpoint the moment it began. There wasn't a single betrayal she could point to, no clean line between before and after. There was only an accumulation, a dinner missed, then two, then a pattern, a promise to visit her grandfather that got rescheduled and rescheduled again. A Christmas spent at a Carter family function instead of the small gathering above the bookstore that had once been sacred. Victoria's influence grew more visible as Damien's company grew larger. Eleanor watched her husband change in increments so small she sometimes doubted her own perception of them. The way he started correcting her grammar in front of investors, the way he stopped introducing her as my wife and started introducing her as Eleanor. She runs a little bookshop, the diminutive doing more damage than any insult could have. Olivia Reyes joined Carter Development in year 4, hired by Victoria over Damien's objections. Objections that softened, Eleanor noticed, faster than seemed reasonable once Olivia proved as brilliant and relentless as Victoria had promised. Eleanor met her exactly twice before that gala. Once at a company function where Olivia had complimented Eleanor's dress in a tone that somehow made the compliment feel like an inventory report, and once at Damien's 40th birthday, where Eleanor had watched her husband laugh at something Olivia said with an ease he hadn't shown at home in longer than she wanted to admit. Eleanor's grandfather died in the spring of year 5. Damien attended the funeral, and Eleanor would later remember that as one of the last moments she still believed, fully and without reservation, that her husband loved her. He held her hand through the entire service. He didn't check his phone once. Afterward, at the small gathering at the bookstore, he stood beside her and shook the hands of neighbors who'd known Walter Brooks for 50 years, and for one afternoon, Eleanor let herself believe the distance between them was temporary, a season, not a sentence. She didn't know that her grandfather's death had also set something else in motion, something Damien and Victoria and Olivia had no idea existed. She didn't know that 3 days after the funeral, a call would come from a law office she'd never heard of, requesting her presence for the reading of a will that, on paper, appeared to leave her nothing but a struggling bookstore and a modest life insurance policy. She didn't know, sitting in that lawyer's office a week later, dressed in the same black dress from the funeral, that the true weight of what her grandfather had left her wouldn't be revealed for another year. That Walter Brooks had structured it deliberately, patiently, so that the truth would only surface when it was needed most. She only knew, in that moment, that the marriage she'd once believed in was slowly disappearing, replaced by something colder and more transactional, and that she had no idea, yet, how to stop it. The year that followed her grandfather's death was the year everything finished breaking. Though it broke so slowly, Eleanor sometimes felt like she was watching a house settle rather than collapse, small cracks appearing in places she'd never thought to check, until one day she looked up and realized the whole structure had shifted around her. Damien's company entered its most aggressive expansion phase that year. The East Bridge redevelopment project, Victoria's brainchild, Damien's obsession, required capital, political favors, and a level of focus that left almost nothing for a marriage that had already been running on fumes. Eleanor kept the bookstore open through sheer stubbornness, working 6 days a week, watching her husband's face appear on business news segments describing a vision for a neighborhood she'd grown up in as though it were an abstraction rather than a home. It was during this year that Eleanor first noticed the particular way Damien and Olivia spoke to each other, a shorthand, an ease, the private language of two people who spent more waking hours together than most married couples did. She never caught them in anything she could name. There was no single moment of proof, no smoking gun, only a slow accumulation of small evidence that added up to a feeling she couldn't shake and couldn't quite justify. Either a wife's intuition dismissed, more than once, by her own husband as insecurity. "You're imagining things," Damien told her once, the one time she'd worked up the courage to ask directly. "Olivia is a colleague. I don't understand why you're doing this." Doing what? Making this harder than it needs to be. She never asked again. Not because she believed him, but because she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that asking had stopped being about getting an honest answer and started being about giving him one more reason to be disappointed in her. If you've ever loved someone and watched them become a stranger a little more each day, if any part of Eleanor's story is hitting closer to home than you expected, take a second and drop a comment below. I want to know if this story is finding you the way it's meant to. Now, Back to Eleanor, because the world she thought she understood is about to change completely. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning, 11 months after Walter Brooks was buried. Eleanor was behind the counter of the bookstore, ringing up a stack of used paperbacks for a regular customer, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Carter. The voice was formal, careful. This is Harold Whitfield. I was your grandfather's attorney. Eleanor frowned. I met with your office already. Last spring. For the will. Yes, Harold said, and something in his tone made the hair on Eleanor's arms rise. This is a separate matter. Your grandfather left specific instructions that this conversation take place exactly 1 year after his passing, and not a day before. I understand that must sound strange. I promise you it will make sense very soon. Could you come to my office this afternoon? Alone, if possible. Eleanor closed the bookstore early for the first time in 3 years. Harold Whitfield's office was smaller than she expected, tucked into a converted brownstone 2 blocks from Eastbridge's old courthouse, a place that looked, Eleanor thought, exactly like the kind of office her grandfather would have chosen. Quiet, unpretentious, easy to overlook. Harold was in his 70s, silver-haired, with the careful manner of a man who had spent his entire career keeping other people's secrets. He greeted Eleanor with a warmth that surprised her, and something else beneath it, something almost like relief. Your grandfather, Harold said, settling behind his desk, was the most patient client I've had in 40 years of practice. He started planning this exact conversation before you were even born. I don't understand, Eleanor said. You will. Harold slid a thick folder across the desk. But first, I need you to understand something about your grandfather that I suspect you never knew. Walter Brooks was not a wealthy man by the standards of the family you married into. But he was, by any honest measure, one of the most powerful men in this city. He simply never wanted anyone to know it. Eleanor stayed at the folder without opening it. The bookstore. The bookstore, Harold said gently, was never the inheritance, Eleanor. It was the key. He opened the folder himself, laying documents across the desk one at a time. And as he spoke, Eleanor felt the floor of her understanding shift and reform beneath her, piece by piece, the way a photograph slowly resolves out of static. Walter Brooks, Harold explained, had spent 40 years quietly acquiring property throughout Eastbridge, not through some single dramatic purchase, but through decades of patient, deliberate accumulation. A building here when an old friend needed to sell. A parcel there when a struggling business owner needed rescue rather than replacement. He had done it slowly enough and carefully enough that almost no one had ever connected the pattern. Dozens of separate purchases across 4 decades, made through a web of holding companies and family trusts with names deliberately chosen to attract no attention. The Millbrook Preservation Trust, the Eastbridge Community Foundation, names that sounded, to anyone who encountered them, like exactly the kind of sleepy non-profit paperwork no one bothers to investigate. Your grandfather, Harold said, came to believe, decades ago, long before anyone was building glass towers in this city, that Eastbridge would eventually become valuable enough that someone would try to take it. Not steal it outright. Buy it. Redevelop it. Erase it, piece by piece, in the name of progress. He decided he would rather own it and protect it than watch it disappear. How much, Eleanor said quietly, are we talking about? Harold slid one final document across the desk, a summary page, dense with legal language, but with one line highlighted in yellow near the bottom. Total holdings under trust control, approximately 94% of the Eastbridge Historic District, encompassing 61 parcels across 6 city blocks. Eleanor read the line 3 times before the words arranged themselves into something she could process. She looked up at Harold. That's almost the entire neighborhood. Yes, and it's mine. You are named sole successor trustee and beneficiary of every holding entity your grandfather controlled, Harold said. Not because of your relation to him, Eleanor, though that mattered to him deeply. Because you were the only person he trusted to protect it rather than sell it. He watched you fight for that bookstore for years. He watched you turn down offers from developers 3 times over the last decade, offers you never even mentioned to your husband, if I understand correctly. Eleanor had turned down those offers without a second thought, each time, because the bookstore wasn't for sale, not for any number. She hadn't realized her grandfather had been watching, taking notes, building his final judgment of a character out of a series of decisions she'd made without ever once thinking of them as a test. He knew, Harold said, more quietly now, that a day might come when you needed leverage that no one could take from you. Not money. Money can be spent, borrowed against, lost. Land, protected the way he protected this, cannot be taken by force, by charm, or by legal maneuvering, provided the trust structure holds. He built something almost impossible to break. Eleanor sat in the small office for a long time after Harold finished speaking, staring at documents that told her she was, in the most literal sense possible, one of the most significant property owners in the city, and that almost no one alive knew it except the silver-haired lawyer sitting across from her. "No one knows," Harold said. "That was your grandfather's explicit instruction. Not even I fully understood the scope until I began preparing these documents for our meeting. He compartmentalized everything. Separate attorneys for separate trusts, separate accountants, separate filings. It took my firm the better part of a year just to consolidate the full picture for this conversation." "Why now? Why exactly 1 year?" Harold's expression softened into something that looked almost like sorrow. "Because your grandfather told me, the week before he died, that he suspected your marriage was already in trouble. He didn't say how he knew. I think, in his way, he simply knew you," he said, and I remember this precisely because it struck me as such an unusual thing for a man to say about his own granddaughter. He said, "Give her time to grieve me properly before she learns what she's carrying. But don't wait so long that she faces whatever's coming without knowing what she has." Eleanor thought of the gala that hadn't happened yet, though she didn't know it was coming, not specifically, not the exact humiliation of that stage and that envelope and that ballroom full of witnesses. She only knew, sitting in Harold Whitfield's office with a folder of documents that redefined everything she thought she understood about her own life, that her grandfather had somehow seen further into her future than she had ever managed to see herself. "What do I do with it?" she asked. "For now," Harold said, "nothing. The trusts are already structured to protect themselves. Your only responsibility, effective today, is to understand what you have and to make sure no one takes it from you before you're ready to decide what to do with it." Eleanor left the office that afternoon carrying a folder that weighed, physically, almost nothing, and carrying, in every other sense, more than she had ever carried in her life. She didn't tell Damien that night. She told herself it was because she needed time to understand it herself first. She would understand, months later, that some smaller and more honest part of her hadn't told him because some smaller and more honest part of her had already begun to suspect she couldn't trust him with it. She was right. She simply didn't know yet how right, or how soon she would find out. The months between that meeting in Harold Whitfield's office and the night of the gala passed the way the last months of anything difficult often do, with a strange, suspended quality, as though Eleanor were living two separate lives inside the same body. In one life, she was a woman quietly watching her marriage disintegrate, showing up to fewer and fewer Carter family functions, noticing the way Damien's eyes moved toward Olivia across rooms with an ease that no longer surprised her, only confirmed something she'd stopped fighting to disbelieve. In the other life, she was a largely unknown custodian of nearly an entire historic district, spending her evenings after the bookstore closed reading through decades of trust documents by lamplight, learning the shape and weight of what her grandfather had left her. She told no one, not her closest friend, Marisol, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down and had known Eleanor since they were girls. Not even, in any complete sense, herself. She found she could hold the knowledge of what she owned and the knowledge of her collapsing marriage in her mind at the same time only by keeping them in entirely separate rooms, refusing to let them touch. She learned, over those months, that her grandfather's foresight had been more thorough than even Harold Whitfield initially understood. Buried within the trust documents was a provision Walter Brooks had added 8 years earlier, a clause requiring the beneficiary trustee's explicit written consent for any large-scale redevelopment project affecting more than a defined threshold of trust-controlled parcels. It was, Harold explained during a follow-up meeting, a mechanism her grandfather had built specifically to prevent exactly the kind of large redevelopment push that a company like Carter Development might one day attempt. He couldn't have known it would be your husband's company, Harold said. But he understood the pattern. He'd watched it happen to other neighborhoods his entire career. A developer identifies undervalued historic property, quietly assembles financing and political support, and moves fast enough that by the time residents understand what's happening, it's already done. He built a mechanism to slow that process down, to force whoever tried it to face a human being who could say no. Eleanor hadn't yet understood, at the time of that conversation, how directly that provision would collide with her own husband's ambitions. She found out 3 weeks before the gala, during a Ray dinner at home when Damien, distracted and expansive with wine, described the Eastbridge project in more detail than he ever had before. The scale of it, the timeline, the investors flying in from 3 continents for the unveiling. "It's the biggest thing I've ever built," he told her. And for a moment, in the candlelight, he looked almost like the man who'd once sat in her grandfather's reading chair talking about legacy instead of leverage. Eastbridge is going to be unrecognizable in 5 years. Glass towers where those old buildings are now. A skyline people will actually want to photograph. Eleanor had sat very still, her fork halfway to her mouth, and asked, as casually as she could manage, "Which buildings, exactly?" "All of it," Damien said, waving a hand. "The whole historic strip. Most of it's practically falling down anyway. Your old bookstore's block. Actually, that whole row is first phase." She hadn't told him, that night, what she knew. She told herself, again, that it wasn't time yet. She understood, more honestly, that some part of her wanted to see what he would do, whether he would find out on his own, through the normal channels of due diligence his company should have already completed, or whether his team's arrogance would let a $100 million project proceed without ever properly investigating who actually owned the land beneath it. She got her answer 3 weeks later. On the same night, Victoria Carter handed her an envelope on a stage in front of 300 people and told her to go back to her little bookstore. Eleanor didn't know, standing on that sidewalk in the rain after walking out of the Whitmore Grand, that 4 floors above the Carter Development offices, at almost the exact same hour, a junior associate on Damien's legal team was staring at his computer screen with a growing sense of dread, trying to understand why a routine title search, a formality, really, the kind of check that should have taken an afternoon and been filed away without a second thought, had returned a result that made no sense. Every parcel in the Eastbridge redevelopment footprint traced back, through a maze of holding companies and preservation trusts, to a single beneficiary trustee. He ran the search 4 times, certain he'd made an error. He hadn't. He would not work up the courage to bring the finding to his supervisors until the following morning. By then, Eleanor was already home, sitting alone in the dark above the bookstore, still wearing her navy dress, still holding, though she didn't fully understand why she'd taken it, the unopened envelope Victoria had pressed into her hands. She opened it, finally, around 2 in the morning, more out of a need to know the exact size of the insult than any real curiosity. The check was for $250,000. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment, and then, for the first time that entire terrible night, she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound in the empty apartment. $250,000. A number that, 24 hours ago, might have felt enormous to a woman who'd spent 6 years running a struggling independent bookstore. A number that was, she now understood with total clarity, roughly what the Carter family would have spent on flowers for the gala that had just humiliated her. She thought of the folder in Harold Whitfield's office. She thought of 94% of a historic district, 61 parcels, 6 city blocks, and a signature clause her grandfather had built specifically to stop men exactly like the one she'd married. She set the check down on the kitchen table, the same table where Damien used to sit describing his dreams of legacy back when they were young enough to still believe legacy and love could be the same thing. She did not cry. She thought, instead, of her grandfather's voice, of the 1,000 small lessons he taught her behind the counter of that bookstore, about patience, about people who underestimated quiet things, about the particular power of simply refusing to disappear when someone wanted you gone. Give her time to grieve me properly. But don't wait so long that she faces whatever's coming without knowing what she has. He had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known this exact night was coming, long before Eleanor herself had any reason to suspect it. She was still sitting at that table when her phone buzzed at 7 the next morning. Not Damien, not Victoria, but Harold Whitfield, his voice tight with something that sounded almost, though it took Eleanor a moment to place it, like satisfaction. "Eleanor," he said, "I need you to come to my office this morning. Carter Development's legal team contacted us an hour ago. They found the trustee's name on the title records." Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time since walking off that stage, she felt something other than grief move through her. Something quieter, steadier, closer to resolve. "Let them find it," she said across the city, in a glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of Carter Tower. Damien stood over his general counsel's desk, staring down at a document that had just been printed for the third time, as though a fourth printing might somehow produce a different name. It didn't. The words sat there in plain, unremarkable font, utterly indifferent to the fact that they were about to end everything Damien Carter had spent 18 months building. Beneficiary trustee, Eastbridge Consolidated Holdings, Eleanor Brooks Carter. Damien stayed at the document so long that the ink seemed to blur. The woman his family had just thrown out of their lives owned the one thing his billion-dollar empire could never build without. Damien did not sleep that night, and by morning he understood that no amount of legal maneuvering was going to make this problem disappear the way problems usually disappeared for him. With a phone call, a settlement, a signature from someone grateful enough for the money not to ask further questions. His general counsel, a controlled and normally unshakable man named Preston Vale, laid it out for him at 6 in the morning with the flat, careful tone of someone delivering a diagnosis. The trust structures were airtight. Preston's team had spent the entire night trying to find a crack in them, a filing error, an expired provision, anything, and had found nothing. Walter Brooks, it turned out, had used 3 different law firms across 4 decades specifically so that no single attorney ever held the full picture until Harold Whitfield had been brought into Consolidated after his death. There was no shortcut. There was no clever restructuring that would let Carter Development proceed without the explicit written consent of one woman. "She has to sign off," Preston said. "There is no version of this project that moves forward without Eleanor's approval. Not without triggering a legal challenge that would tie up every parcel in litigation for a decade." Damien sat with that for a long moment, and then he did what he had always done when a problem grew larger than his own ability to solve it. He called his mother. Victoria arrived at Carter Tower within the hour, and Eleanor would learn, much later, exactly what was said in that meeting, because Preston Vale, disturbed by what he witnessed that morning, would eventually tell her himself. Victoria did not ask whether the situation could be managed with warmth or humility or the kind of honest reckoning that might have actually worked. She asked what it would cost. "Everyone has a price," Victoria said, according to Preston's account. "The gal ran a bookstore for 6 years instead of taking money from us the easy way. That's not principle. That's negotiating leverage. Find her number." They started at $50 million, delivered not by Damien but by a Carter Development attorney who arrived at the bookstore 3 days after the gala with a folder and an expression of professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor read the office standing behind the same counter where she'd first met Damien, surrounded by the same shelves, and she declined it in 4 words. "The store isn't for sale." The attorney blinked. "This isn't about the store, Mrs. Carter. This is about the trust holdings." "I know what it's about," Eleanor said. The answer is still no. The offers escalated the way Eleanor had somehow known they would, each one arriving with slightly more urgency than the last, as though the Carter family's confidence in the power of a large number to solve any problem simply couldn't accept that it might not work this time. 50 million became 150. 150 became 400. Eventually, a man Eleanor had never met, introduced only as a representative of the Carter family office, sat across from her at a downtown restaurant she hadn't chosen and slid a folder across the table with a number that made the waiter, refilling water 2 tables away, visibly pause. $750 million. Eleanor looked at the number for a long moment, and then looked up at the man across the table, whose expensive suit and careful smile reminded her, with an unpleasant jolt, of the version of Damien she'd met 8 years ago in her grandfather's bookstore, before she'd learned what that particular smile could conceal. "No," she said, and stood and left the folder on the table. A week later, the number reached $1 billion, delivered this time by Victoria herself, who arrived at the bookstore unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed as though she were attending another gala, standing amid the shelves of used paperbacks like a woman who had wandered by mistake into someone else's life. "You've made your point," Victoria said, without preamble, without apology for the ballroom, without acknowledging that a point had ever needed making. $8 billion, Eleanor. You could build 100 bookstores. You could build anything you wanted, anywhere in the world. This isn't dignity anymore. This is spite. Eleanor set down the book she'd been reshelving and looked at her former mother-in-law. Because that was, she realized in that moment, precisely what Victoria now was, whatever legal papers had or hadn't yet been signed, with something that felt less like anger than a kind of exhausted clarity. "You handed me a check for $250,000 on a stage in front of 300 people," Eleanor said, "and told me to go back to my little bookstore. You didn't ask me what I wanted that night. You told me what I was worth to your family, and then you were surprised when I believed you. This is business." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "This was never business for you, Victoria. If it were business, you would have called me the moment your lawyers found my name on that title search, and you would have asked me, respectfully, what it would take to have a conversation. Instead, you sent a stranger to a restaurant. You sent your son's lawyer to my store. You did everything except the one thing that might actually have worked." Something moved behind Victoria's eyes then. Not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. A flicker of a woman who had spent so many decades winning through leverage that she had genuinely forgotten there was any other approach available. "And what," Victoria said, her voice cooling several more degrees, "would that have been?" "Asking," Eleanor said. Victoria left without another word, and Eleanor stood alone in the bookstore for a long time afterward, surrounded by the quiet dust and stillness that had once felt like poverty and now, she was slowly beginning to understand, felt more like armor. If you've made it this far into Eleanor's story, I think you already know she's not the kind of woman who's going to be bought, but staying power like haze doesn't come easily, and if this story is starting to get under your skin the way it should, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happens in the next stretch of this story is the part that changes everything. Now, back to Eleanor, because someone else is about to come looking for answers, and this time, it's not about money at all. Damien came alone, 3 weeks after the gala, on an evening when Eleanor was closing the bookstore by herself, pulling the metal grate halfway down over the front window before she noticed him standing on the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, looking, for the first time in longer than she could remember, uncertain of himself. "Can we talk?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Eleanor considered saying no. She considered a great many things in the 3 seconds before she stepped back and let him inside, the bell above the door chiming the way it had chimed the first day he'd wandered in, lost, looking for a coffee shop he never found. They sat in the reading chairs near the back, the same chairs where he used to talk about legacy, years ago, before legacy had curdled into something else. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The store settled around them with its familiar creaks and silences, the particular hush of a small business at the end of a long day. "Why didn't you tell me?" Damien finally asked. Eleanor had expected the question. She'd rehearsed a dozen answers in the weeks since the gala, versions that were angrier, versions that were colder, versions designed to wound him the way she'd been wounded. In the moment, none of those versions felt true anymore. "Because I wanted to know whether you loved me," she said, "or what my family could give you." Damien flinched, almost imperceptibly, and looked down at his hands. "That's not fair," he said, but there was no real conviction in it. "Isn't it?" Eleanor kept her voice steady, not cruel, simply honest. "You stopped introducing me as your wife 2 years ago, Damien. You started introducing me as a woman who runs a little bookshop. I watched you shrink me, piece by piece, in front of people whose opinions mattered more to you than mine. And then, the one time it mattered, the one night I needed you to say something, anything, on that stage, you said nothing at all. I didn't know what to say. You didn't try to find out. Silence again, longer this time, filled with the particular ache of two people who had once loved each other honestly enough to now understand, with total clarity, exactly how far that love had drifted. My grandfather knew, Eleanor said eventually, that a day might come when your family would try to take something from me, not because he could see the future, but because he understood, better than anyone I've ever known, how people like your mother operate. He spent 40 years building something no amount of pressure could break. Every contingency, every possible attack, planned for decades before it happened. Damien looked up at her, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, she saw something in his expression that looked less like a businessman assessing a problem and more like a man beginning, slowly and painfully, to understand the actual shape of what he had lost. I never wanted to erase you, he said quietly. You didn't have to want it, Eleanor said. You just had to let it happen. There's a version of you, Damien, that I loved in this exact room, a long time ago. I don't think that version disappeared completely. I think you let your mother's version of success replace it, one compromise at a time, until you couldn't tell the difference anymore. He didn't argue with her. That, more than anything he might have said, told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how far things had actually gone. He left the bookstore that night without asking her to sign anything, without mentioning the project, without pressing for the one thing his entire company now desperately needed from her. Eleanor watched him walk away down the darkened street through the front window, and she felt, unexpectedly, a small and complicated grief, not for the marriage she'd lost, which she understood now had been dying for years before that gala ever happened, but for the man she'd once believed he could have been, if different choices had been made, if different voices had been louder in his life than his mother's. She didn't yet know that Damien's meeting with her had set something else in motion, that Preston Vale, watching his employer grow visibly shaken in the days that followed, had begun quietly documenting decisions he suspected Victoria was making without full board authorization. She didn't know that Olivia Reyes, watching investor confidence in the East Bridge project erode by the day, had begun making calls of her own, calls that had nothing to do with saving Damien's company, and everything to do with saving herself. The collapse, when it finally came, did not happen all at once. It happened the way most collapses happen in businesses built on confidence rather than substance, slowly, and then all at once. It began with a single investor, a private equity fund out of Singapore that had committed $200 million to the Eastbridge project, quietly requesting a meeting to review the title status of the underlying parcels. Preston Vale had no honest answer to give them. Within a week, the fund withdrew its commitment entirely, citing unresolved property rights concerns in a one-paragraph letter that would later be leaked, in full, to 3 separate financial news outlets. The leak was not, as Victoria initially assumed, an act of sabotage by Eleanor. Eleanor had said nothing publicly about any of it, had given no interviews, had made no statements. The leak came from inside Carter Development itself, though it would take weeks for anyone to trace it back to Preston Vale, a man who had spent 15 years quietly documenting every instruction Victoria Carter had ever given him that skirted the edges of what was legal, and who had finally, watching an innocent woman get offered $1 billion to disappear, decided he'd documented enough once the story broke. It moved with the particular velocity that financial scandal always seems to find. Carter Development's $1 billion redevelopment frozen by mystery trustee, read one headline. Who is Eleanor Brooks Carter? Read another, beneath a photograph of Eleanor that someone had pulled from an old community newspaper article about the bookstore's 50th anniversary. Eleanor at the counter, unglamorous, unguarded, utterly unlike the image the Carter family had spent years cultivating around itself. The stock began to fall the day the story broke, and it did not stop falling for 3 straight weeks. Banks that had extended construction financing began asking uncomfortable questions about collateral and timelines. Board members who had approved the project on the strength of Victoria's confidence began, quietly at first and then less quietly, requesting emergency meetings. Olivia Reyes watched all of this unfold from her office on the 38th floor with the particular clear-eyed calculation of a woman who had spent her career reading which way the wind was about to blow. She had never loved Damien. Not really. She understood that about herself with more honesty than either Carter had ever managed about their own marriage. She had loved his trajectory, his momentum, the particular gravitational pull of a man everyone assumed was going to win. Watching that trajectory bend downward, she made the only decision that had ever truly mattered to her. She resigned by email on a Friday afternoon, effective immediately, citing personal reasons in a letter that took 4 sentences to say nothing at all. By Monday, she had accepted a position at a rival development firm across the city, taking with her 3 years of institutional knowledge about Carter Development's operations and, though no one could ever prove it in the aftermath, a working understanding of exactly how vulnerable the company's finances had become. Damien learned of her resignation the way he learned most difficult news that season. Secondhand, through an assistant, delivered in the flat tone of someone who had grown accustomed to bad news arriving without warning. He sat alone in his office that evening, the city lights spread out beneath him the way they always had, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that everyone who had orbited him during his ascent had already begun calculating their exit before his fall had even finished happening. This is the part of the story where everything Eleanor's family built either gets erased for good, or becomes something none of them ever expected. And if you've stayed with her this long, through the humiliation, through the discovery, through everything it took to get here, you already know she's earned whatever comes next. If this story has moved you even a little, take a moment now and drop a comment about the moment that hit you hardest, because we're almost at the ending, and I don't want you to miss what Eleanor decides to do with everything she's finally been given the power to choose. The board of Carter Development called an emergency shareholder vote 6 weeks after the gala, and Victoria Carter, for the first time in the company's history, found herself on the losing end of a vote she had once controlled without question. The board did not remove her outright. The optics, even in crisis, mattered too much for that. But they stripped her of operational authority over the Eastbridge project entirely and installed an independent oversight committee tasked with, among other things, opening a formal dialogue with the trust beneficiary. That dialogue happened, finally, on Eleanor's terms, in Harold Whitfield's small, unpretentious office, 3 months after the night she'd walked off a stage carrying an envelope she hadn't asked for. Across the table sat not Victoria, and not Damien, but a newly appointed committee chair, a woman named Dana Osei, calm and unhurried, who opened the meeting with words Eleanor had begun to think no one in that family knew how to say. "We'd like to understand what you actually want," Dana said. "Not what we assume you want. What you want." Eleanor had spent 3 months thinking about that exact question, turning it over during quiet hours at the bookstore, during long evenings reading through her grandfather's decades of careful documentation, trying to understand what he would have wanted her to build from everything he protected. Everyone had expected Eleanor Brooks to destroy the Carter family the way they had once tried to destroy her. Publicly, decisively, with the particular cold satisfaction of long overdue revenge. Eleanor understood that expectation. There were nights, in the rawest weeks after the gala, when she had wanted exactly that. But somewhere in Harold Whitfield's careful explanations, somewhere in the quiet dust of the bookstore that had raised her, somewhere in the memory of her grandfather's voice explaining that a neighborhood without a bookstore was a neighborhood that had forgotten how to dream, Eleanor had arrived at a different understanding of what victory actually meant. "I don't want to build glass towers," she told Dana, "and I'm not interested in punishing anyone for the sake of punishment. What I want is for Eastbridge to stay exactly what it's always been, a place people can afford to live and work and dream in. I want to restore what's falling down, not replace it. I want the historic district protected permanently, not just because my grandfather spent his whole life doing it, but because I've watched what happens to neighborhoods that get treated like empty canvases instead of homes." Over the following months, working with Harold, with Dana's oversight committee, and eventually with a team of preservation architects and community planners Eleanor assembled herself, she announced a comprehensive restoration plan for the Eastbridge Historic District, not a redevelopment, but a revival. restoration grants for the district's aging buildings, affordable housing set-asides built into every renovated property, below-market retail space reserved for local, independent businesses, a new branch library funded by the Brooks Family Trust, a scholarship program for Eastbridge students, named, at Harold's quiet suggestion, after Walter Brooks himself. Youth literacy initiatives run out of the bookstore that had started it all. The historic district was formally declared a protected landmark 8 months after the gala, a designation that made large-scale redevelopment permanently impossible and, in the process, sent property values across the neighborhood higher than any glass tower ever could have. Local businesses that had been quietly bracing for eviction notices found themselves, instead, receiving letters offering renewed leases at reduced rates. The bookstore's old block, the same block Damien had once described as practically falling down, became, within 2 years, one of the most sought-after commercial corridors in the city, not because it had been transformed into something else, but because it had finally been allowed to become fully itself. Damien Carter watched all of this happen from a considerable distance. The Eastbridge project, in its original form, was formally dissolved 11 months after the gala, absorbed into a settlement that saw Carter Development's remaining stake in the district's non-trust-controlled parcels sold at a steep loss to cover the company's mounting debts. Victoria retained her seat on the board. Technically, though her influence over the company she'd spent decades building had been reduced to something closer to a formality. The Carters did not go bankrupt. The family's fortune was too large and too diversified for a single failed project to end it entirely. But something more permanent than money had been lost, and everyone who watched the company's slow, humbled recovery understood it. For Damien, the reckoning was quieter than a headline, and harder, in its way, than any public humiliation could have been. He spent the better part of a year in something like isolation. Not exile, exactly, since no one had forced him out, but the particular self-imposed distance of a man finally forced to sit with decisions he could no longer outrun. He resigned from his operational role at Carter Development 18 months after the gala, citing a need to reassess priorities in a statement that, for once, wasn't written by a publicist trying to spin a loss into a strategic pivot. He did not reach out to Eleanor during that year, and she did not reach out to him. They both seemed to understand without ever discussing it, a necessary distance required before anything honest could exist between them again, if anything ever would. The divorce was finalized quietly, 14 months after the gala, with none of the theater that had once surrounded their marriage ending. There was no envelope. There was no stage. There was a lawyer's office, a handful of signatures, and a silence between two people who had once, a long time ago, sat in a broken-down car's aftermath and imagined an entirely different future for themselves. 2 years after the night Victoria Carter told her to go back to her little bookstore, Eleanor stood behind the same counter where she had met her husband, in a store that had grown, slowly and deliberately, into something larger than either of them could have imagined that first afternoon. Not larger in size, but larger in what it meant to the 6 blocks that surrounded it. The old reading chairs were still there. The framed photograph of her grandfather still hung behind the register, though it now shared the wall with newer photographs. The ribbon cutting for the new library branch, the first graduating class of Brooks scholars, a community mural painted across the side of a building that had, a lifetime ago, nearly been slated for demolition. Damien walked through the district on a Saturday afternoon that spring, something he did occasionally now, quietly, without fanfare, the way a man visits a place that used to matter to him more than he'd known how to say at the time. He watched children reading on the library steps, families gathered in the small park that had once been an empty lot the Carter Development team had earmarked for a parking structure, the historic storefronts standing exactly as they'd always stood, restored rather than replaced. He realized, walking through streets he had once planned to erase entirely, that everything he had tried to build over had become, in Eleanor's hands, the city's most treasured neighborhood, not because she had spent more money than he would have, but because she had understood, in a way he'd forgotten how to, that some things become more valuable by being protected rather than transformed. He did not go into the bookstore that day. He stood across the street for a long moment, watching through the window as Eleanor helped an elderly customer find a book on the shelf her grandfather had built with his own hands, and then he turned and walked on, carrying with him an understanding that had cost him almost everything to learn. Inside, a young girl approached the counter clutching a worn paperback, her mother browsing the shelves nearby. "Did you build all of this?" the girl asked, looking up at Eleanor with a particular unguarded curiosity that only children still seem to have. Eleanor smiled softly and glanced, for a moment, at the old photograph behind the register, a young man standing proud and unsmiling in front of this same storefront in 1968, a man who had spent 40 patient years protecting a future he would never fully see. "No," she said. "Someone who believed the future was worth protecting simply trusted me to finish what he started." The little girl nodded, seeming to accept this answer with the easy faith children extend to things they don't yet need to fully understand, and headed for the door, her newly borrowed book held carefully against her chest. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped outside. Across the street, the afternoon sun spilled over the restored district, over families walking together, over storefronts that had nearly disappeared and instead had been given a second life, over a neighborhood that had almost become someone else's monument to ambition and had, instead, remained exactly what it was always meant to be, a place where people could still afford to dream. Eleanor watched from the window for a long moment, not with triumph, and not with the particular satisfaction of someone who had won a battle she'd never asked to fight, but with something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't guarding a legacy. She was living it. If Eleanor's story taught you anything today, about patience, about quiet strength, about what it really means to build something that lasts, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And let me know in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking with you tonight. Thank you for spending this time with Eleanor's story. I'll see you in the next one.